Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brooks Mitchell. I'm the education coordinator here at Space Science Institute, the National Center for Interactive Learning. We are so lucky today to be joined by Brian Day. He's going to be talking about some different applications for International Observe the Moon Night. And this webinar is going to be pretty much all about ways you can integrate this event into your library's programming. We're really excited, and this opportunity is a great one for libraries and library staff. So just to start out with, if you are having any audio problems, well, then you probably can't hear my audio right now, but you can look at the bottom of the screen and there are tips for how to adjust your audio. Let's get this right here. And also, this meeting is being recorded. We're going to upload it to YouTube in just a few days. So just those couple of notices and heads up. During the webinar, if you could perhaps just enter any questions you have in the chat box down below. And I'd like to start things off today by asking a poll question. And you can feel free to answer the poll question, but then go ahead and put any additional comments that you might have down in the chat box. So with these webinars, we really want to help you out with your programming. And I know I've heard a lot of responses from people that say, well, we plan our programming out 5 months in advance. Or some have said, we plan our programming out just a couple of weeks in advance. So for a big event like this, International Observe the Moon Night, I've also put African American History Month as an example, perhaps the Cassini Grand Finale, the solar eclipse, even though that was a pretty big event, so I'm sure you all planned for that pretty far in advance. But we want to figure out when the best timing is for these webinars for you all. If you're planning out International Observe the Moon Night back in January, well then we know that we need to do our webinars a little bit earlier for you. So I'll give you all about 5 or 10 seconds to answer that poll question. And again, feel free to comment down below in the chat box. And also, how about just to get everybody comfortable with using that chat box, go ahead and put your name, or go ahead and, put the location that you are from, and also your role within the library. So I would say, I'm Brooks, I'm the education coordinator at SSI in Boulder. Just go ahead and introduce yourself. I see a lot of multiple attendees typing. Oh, hey, Anne. I can also wave to you that way, too. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces, or familiar names, I should say. Oh, hey, Jessica. I'm from Atlanta originally myself. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and broadcast these results from the poll so you guys can see. It's actually pretty varied responses. Lauren, I see your comment. We publish a calendar of events 3 months in advance. That's good to know. Hey, Caroline. So I'm going to open up these poll results about 5 seconds. All right. So you guys can see pretty all across the board answers. Nobody seems to plan their programming out a few days in advance. I imagine it's kind of what I was predicting as well. Great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hide that poll. So great, and I just wanted to get you guys talking in the chat box. Again, feel free during our presentation today to put any questions that you have in the chat box, and if we can't answer them right away, I'll put them in our little presenters only area, and we'll answer that at the conclusion of, hey Lori, at the conclusion of our webinar today, or of Brian's presentation. Great. So of course, as a reminder, most of you are probably familiar with StarNet. You're probably signed up for the newsletter, and that's how you heard about the webinar today. If you're not, this is a very valuable resource for library staff. StarNet has a lot of professional development resources, including webinars, newsletters, blogs, forums, videos, much more. We kind of, I want to say, cultivated or curated this website to be specifically for library staff and bringing those science, technology, engineering, and math activities to library staff. So please log on to StarNet, sign up for the newsletter. There is a ton of great information and resources out there. So speaking of professional development resources, I just wanted to highlight a few upcoming webinars and other PD resources that we have coming up. Our next webinar is called Hands-On Fun with StarNet. I will be just kind of displaying a few different hands-on activities that you guys can take to your libraries. After that, and this is very exciting, we have 2 new webinars. We'll be joined by the Deputy Director of Social Media at NASA, and he'll be sharing some social media tips. So we haven't quite opened up registration for that. It was just kind of recently confirmed. So we'll open up probably, within this week. Make sure to check the StarNet webinar resources page. Greg, if you could put that link in there. That's going to be a really popular webinar, so I recommend signing up early. Also, in mid-December, we're going to do a webinar all about programming opportunities for 2018. For some of you guys that said you plan your stuff out 6 months in advance, well, if we do one in December, we think we can cover a few different programming opportunities. Let's see, like Engineer Week, African American History Month, a few different NASA events throughout the year. There are a lot of different events, and we want to give you guys a lot of a heads up. In the top right, we archive all of our webinars. We upload them to YouTube. You can find that link there. And we are entering conference season here at Space Science Institute. We are all, it seems, going to be at a different conference every week. So some of the highlights, I will be at MPLA, the Mountain Plain Library Association Conference, and it's in conjunction with the Nevada Library Association Conference this year. That'll be in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. We'll be at CalCon in Loveland, Colorado, and that'll be, next week. We're going to be at the Mountain Plain Museum Association, if there's any museum folks out there. In early November, I will be at the Young Adult Library Symposium Association. Sorry, it's a lot of acronyms, guys. I'm trying to make sure I remember all of them. We'll be at Aztec. I believe we'll be at IMLS too. And so if you're at any of these conferences, make sure to check out our conferences page on StarNet. Come see us. I'll be presenting a session at MPLA, and I'll be part of the Tech Teen Showcase at YALSA. And so please come visit us. We love putting faces with names of these all of you that we get to interact with. Also on our clearinghouse, the STEM Activity Clearinghouse, which is a part of StarNet, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we've kind of started to expand our content a little bit. As part of another project we're doing, we're developing a lot of engineering content. So the most recent collection we have up on the clearinghouse is Fantastic Bridges. It's a lot of bridge-related activities. That could be really useful in a library setting. Speaking of our clearinghouse, there we go. Please check out our STEM Activity Clearinghouse. We have a plethora of activities, over 130, I think, activities, of course, STEM activities, designed for a library setting. So anybody, of course, is welcome to go into the clearinghouse and pull an activity, but all of these activities are specifically designed for the idea of a library, a library setting, and a library kind of staff comfort level too. If you do go to the STEM Activity Clearinghouse, you pull a review. Here we have up here, do-it-yourself sun cookies. That's a lot of fun, and actually kind of similar to the activity we're going to do today. Make sure to leave a review. Like if you found anything that's really helpful, if you really love an activity, but there's one part of it that you would change, or if you just didn't like an activity at all and you think, hey, this doesn't really work for the library setting, please let us know and let other library staff know. So please make sure to leave a review. We may be revamping that review system to make it easy and sortable for you in the future. And so I see Kellyanne saying, including lots of options for celebrating the moon. That's right. We have one whole moon collection or moon content area where you can pull activities for International Observe the Moon Night. Okay, so we're ready to move on to our hands-on activity for today. I chose this one. It's called Loonie Lunar Phases. You can see the screenshot of how it looks on the STEM Activity Clearinghouse right here. And I chose this activity for a few reasons. One of the reasons is, International Observe the Moon Night is October 28th, so it's coming up quick. And if you're thinking, oh, I can't really do this full-fledged program, I can't do an hour-long program, you can still integrate International Observe the Moon Night into something like a story time. So this activity specifically works well with the idea of doing a story time and maybe having a small activity tied into it. So it has that literature component to it as well, and I'll explain kind of how that ties in. Also, Explaining moon phases to an audience, it can be really confusing. It's a tough concept for a lot of participants to understand, a lot of younger patrons. So this doesn't necessarily try to explain why the moon has different phases. Instead, it just kind of points out those different phases and allows patrons or participants to kind of tie a particular moon phase with what they see in the sky. So they might not know, I don't know what gibbous is, I don't know what a crescent is, what's waxing, what's waning. This activity is going to kind of help them understand those terms and tie in a visual with those terms as well. So you can see on the right-hand side, it might be coming up a little grainy on this slide, but it's about maybe approximately a 30-minute activity. It's also pretty cheap, maybe $1 to $5. Really all you need is a box of Oreos, and if you're anything like me, you always have a box of Oreos laying around. And you need maybe some paper towels and a couple of print-off sheets as well. So really excited about this activity. I'll give you guys kind of a brief overview. To start out with, you read a book or read a story, a poem, or even listen to a song that ties into the moon, that has something to do with the moon. I like the idea of doing a poem or a book, and I think you could probably play a song in the background. Here we go. So I've pulled a few different books and songs and poems that you could use. Of course, I'm sure there are plenty more out there, but you kind of want to tie in that cultural element. So not necessarily why is it a full moon, but what throughout culture and throughout our history, what kind of influence does that those different lunar phases have on human civilization? So, you know, every full moon has a different name. You have the worm moon, you might have the wolf moon, and so it's really interesting to understand how those names kind of came to be. I think there's also like the sap moon, or you know, during fall when trees start to sap. So tying that cultural element is great. So here's a list of books, here's a list of songs and poems, and of course, once you go into the activity, those will get pulled up as well. So you start out by reading a book, reading a song, reading a poem, and then you kind of dive into the vocabulary, if you will, or learning about those actual different phases of the moon. So here are the supplies. Really all you need are a few Oreo cookies. It says you can also do round cream cheese sandwich crackers. I, of course, prefer Oreos. A paper towel, a plastic spoon and or a plastic knife, and this sheet, Cookie Moon Phases. Now I'll go back 2 slides, and you see on this slide, they've used a paper plate and they've created their own chart of the different phases of the moon in the different order. That is great. I think that's maybe kind of somewhat more of an advanced concept of having them actually label it out and place those different cookies. So I would recommend, if this is your first lesson, if it's your first bit of information about the moon, go ahead and print out this Cookie Moon Phases sheet. And have your students create their Oreo moon phases and place them on this sheet instead of having them do it on a paper plate and writing out those different moon phases. So I will show you guys. Give me a second to go over to my other cam here. Also, I chose this activity because, well, who doesn't like to eat cookies? All right, so you can see here I have my Cookie Moon Phases sheet. I have a plastic knife and a plastic fork. Of course, you could do this with other things like I don't know, maybe even a toothpick or like a tongue depressor. I have my box of cookies here. And I've already kind of created some. And so basically, you'll have your patrons look at this sheet. They'll identify these different phases of the moon. And so there's a few different ways you could facilitate this. The first, or the way I would personally do it, is to have your patrons, you know, you're talking to them and you're saying, okay, so first we're going to talk about a new moon. Now, a new moon is when it is completely or almost completely dark. And then have them scrape off all of the frosting. It's the best part, I know. And for the new moon, you could actually just turn it around and put it down there. So let's go on. We're moving on to the waxing crescent. You will have, let's see, I've already gotten this one off a little bit. So you have your cookie here. Scrape off that icing. It's not going to be perfect, of course. I don't think your younger kids will mind that too much. You can place your waxing crescent right on there. The next one we're going to do a first quarter or a half moon. You can talk about it. You can say the right half of the moon is light scrape it off a little bit, place that on there, and so on and so forth. And you can do that for all 8 of these phases. All right, give me just 1 second to get my webcam pulled back up. All right. So a really fun activity, a really tasty activity too. I know everybody at SSI here is excited that I chose this activity so we can eat cookies afterwards. Kendra said, or you said, I won't lie, playing with cookies makes this the best job in the world. You are absolutely right. Even at the ALA conference that we did a session for, we ended up playing with cookies, and I ended up eating a lot of them as well. Any suggestions for kids with food intolerances? That's a great question, Kendra. Anne points out that Oreos are dairy-free. I don't think there's any nut product in Oreos. I'm not an expert. You would probably need to look that up yourself. But if there are nuts, of course, that's a big concern with allergens or with gluten intolerances. So definitely you want to check your ingredients beforehand and check with the kids to make sure that there aren't any major allergies. That's a very good point. All right, any other questions about this activity before we move on? Okay. Do this with any fruit that has a different colored meat and peel. That's good advice. Yeah, a little bit healthier option with the fruit. And guys, like I said, if you want to have the paper plate and have them make that own template for themselves, that's great. It's just somewhat, maybe a little bit more advanced, maybe good as a second or a third lesson. And also, while they're eating the cookies, that's a good time to, again, talk about those cultural elements of the moon, too. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce to you guys Brian Day. We're so excited that he joined us. I got to meet and hang out with Brian a little bit at the ALA conference this past year. He's a wonderful guy. His official title, he's the lead for lunar and planetary mapping and modeling at NASA's Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute. It's quite a title. But just to point out a few of his accomplishments, he's discovered deposits of water ice at the moon's south pole. He has recorded fragments of comets in the Earth's upper atmosphere. And most importantly, of course, his hobbies include photography, wine, volcanoes, and chasing total solar eclipses around the world. Sounds like a pretty great guy. So without further ado, I'm going to unmute him real quick. And without further ado, Brian Day.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Great to be with you. After that last hands-on activity, I'm feeling really quite hungry at the moment. But I'll just point out the discovery of water on the moon. I don't get to take credit for that. I got to work. I had the privilege of working on the L-Cross mission, which had some just brilliant people on it. And that was the mission where we actually did discover ice at the south pole of the moon. Really very exciting. I got to play a small role in that mission. It was a really, really fun experience. But speaking of fun experiences, we've got one coming up on October 28th. That is International Observe the Moon Night. I'm sure you are all aware of that and planning your events coming up. Now, if you're aware of International Observe the Moon Night, one of the things you will know about is hopefully that you can go to the InOMN website, observethemoonnight.org, and you can download a map. And every year I put together a map that shows some of the features that are particularly well placed for observing. And that changes, of course, from year to year because we have different phases of the moon from different year to year. But what we try and do is highlight objects that are visible to the unaided eye, through binoculars, and through telescopes. And when it comes to telescopes, we tend to feature objects that look like they're toward the terminator, that line between day and night, the light and dark on the moon, because that's where the shadows are really the greatest. And that's where even small features will really stand out best. So that viewing along the terminator is a good strategy for looking at objects that have some relief, that stand up above the surface to some degree. So This is the front page of the map. It shows kind of the areas that we're focusing on. The flip side of the map zooms in on those telescopic regions and shows them as rendered through a program called MoonTrek. Now, I'm going to introduce you to MoonTrek, but this gives you higher resolution, higher power views of these telescopic features and some descriptions of them. But we'll take a closer look at these today. So again, we're going to use MoonTrek. This is a program developed by NASA. It's been developed for the purpose of site selection, mission planning, lunar science, as well as public outreach. So it's got a lot of applications. And the great thing about it is there's nothing to buy, there's nothing to install. It runs on your web browser. So point your laptop or desktop computer. Ideally, I'd suggest using the Chrome browser. Point it to our URL, moontrek.jpl.nasa.gov. We'll make sure you have that. And you can explore the moon as seen through the eyes of many different instruments on many different spacecraft. This is really great for you in your library settings because there will be situations where perhaps you do not have access to a high power telescope to look at the moon. Or perhaps you are conducting a program that is not during a time of day when the moon is visible, or perhaps the weather isn't even cooperating. But by using MoonTrek, you can take your audiences there in the libraries on very detailed trips and explorations across the surface of the moon. Anytime, from any place. It's really very exciting. And so I hope you do make use of MoonTrek in your library programs. So let's take a look at how MoonTrek works. And so Brooks, if you could load our first video here. And this is kind of a real-time example of how we use MoonTrek. And it's going to buffer for just a second here. And hopefully, there we go, start playing. And so what you'll see is that we are actually able to pan and zoom across the surface of the moon. And what we're going to do here is we're going to pan down to the crater Tycho. And we'll zoom in on it here, and we can see some really fine detail. Now, one of the things the kids will first ask you about this is how big is it? Well, it's really easy to measure features on MoonTrek. You just draw a line across and you can actually measure a distance. They'll also probably ask, well, how deep is that? And again, we can use MoonTrek to calculate an elevation profile. We'll draw another line. This time we'll extend on either side of the rim. And here we go. We can go and generate a nice elevation profile. Let's move the crater to the side there so we can see it. And as we move up and down along the profile there, you can see the point that we're looking at on the traverse. But wait, there's more. We can go ahead and now do a generation of a 3D print file. You simply draw a rectangle around any surface feature that you like, and you can generate. Okay, so let's get out of that video there. And so Brooks, if we can, there we go. You can actually generate a 3D print file. I've got a picture of one there in the slides, and I'm holding up one. These are really super popular. These are really neat. So if you've got a 3D printer, you can go and generate 3D prints of any portion of the moon that you like. Very, very popular. So now let's load in our next movie. And this is going to show how we can really use MoonTrek to go flying across the surface of the moon and really explore in detail. There is a 3D mode in MoonTrek. And let's see, we're waiting for our video. Is the video loading there, Brooks?
Yeah, it is. Give me just 1 second to try and maximize it.
Okay, very good.
Hold on just one brief moment. Is that coming through, Brian?
I'm not seeing it. Oh, it's there. It's really, really small. Is everybody else seeing it? So basically what this allows you to do is use game controls, standard keyboard game controls, to go flying across the surface of the moon. So I'm seeing this as a tiny, almost little dot of a video. I hope everybody else is seeing this full size here, but we can fly down into the crater Tycho and then drop down to the ground and zoom along the surface, heading right up toward the central peak of Tycho crater. So hopefully you're all able to see that. And let's go ahead.
Yeah, give me just 1 second. Let's see. Sorry, Brian, just give me 1 moment.
Okay.
Hey, folks, were you able to see that? If you you can comment in the chat box. Okay, great.
Okay, very, very good. Okay, so now we're going to move on, and we'll take a quick look at the map again. And one of the things we see, and this will be visible to your unaided eye, is the difference between the light highland areas and the dark mare. The mare, sometimes called seas. Originally, people thought they were full of water. They're not. These are vast plains of basaltic lava. So they show up very well here in this full disk view from Moon Trek. And let's back up here just, well, no, we'll go ahead this way. Take a look here. Now we're switching to a laser altimetry view, and we can see how a lot of these mare actually are in the form of basins, round impact basins. So here's Mare Serenitatis, Mare Crisium, and if we go back here, we can see on our map how these are actually labeled. So C here is Mare Serenitatis, D is Mare Crisium, E is Mare Tranquillitatis, the Sea of Tranquility, where Apollo 11 first landed. So keep your eye on this Sea of Tranquility here. And as we march across, we'll see something interesting. So here it is showing up very nicely in just our photographic view. In our laser altimetry view, you notice it doesn't really correspond to a basin like some of these others, at least not so obviously. If we switch now to a gravity map view, notice like here, the Sea of Serenity, Mare Serenitatis, Imbrium, Nectarous, Crisium, all of these show up. These are what we call mass concentrations. And gravity is stronger in these areas. But interestingly, here in the Sea of Tranquility, we're really not seeing that. So there's still some real significant mysteries with the moon. We're still exploring the moon in great detail, and we've got lots of questions we want to answer. Why is this different? So now, let's take a look at the far side of the moon, the side that we never see from here on Earth. And it looks different. You don't see those dark mare there. And the main question that comes to mind is, of course, why? It seems that the crust on the far side of the moon is thicker than the crust on the near side. And so it was harder for that lava to break out and cover areas of terrain. Again, why is that the case? We're still not sure. So going back to our map, what we're going to do next is we'll take a closer look at one of these seas. If you look at the one labeled D on the map, that's Mare Crisium. And here we are looking at it more closely with Moon Trek. And you can see this nice dark area in the center there. Mare Crisium is about 555 kilometers across. It looks somewhat squashed here because, well, we're seeing it on the edge of the moon, and it's foreshortened. Now, with with Moon Trek, we can go ahead and change our position so we can look directly down on it. And when we do, we see something interesting. It is not circular. It is elongated, but in exactly the opposite way that we were seeing it before. So that's really interesting. That probably tells us something about the formation of this and perhaps the angle that the impactor hit. Let's zoom in a little closer, and we notice something also very interesting, that the mare, these vast expanses of basaltic lava, they are much smoother than the surrounding highlands. Note how the surrounding highlands are very intensely pocked by craters, whereas you see many fewer craters in the mare area. And this speaks to the relative ages of the terrain. When you have an event that essentially resurfaces a portion of the moon, you cover up previously existing craters. Now, the moon is experiencing a continuing bombardment by rocks from space that form these craters. And so one of the things that we can tell from this is that as we look at terrain that has more craters is older terrain. Terrain that has fewer craters is younger terrain. So we can see here that Mare Crisium, the floor of it, is younger than the surrounding areas. We can again measure the distance across. You can have your kids measure heights and notice the relative smoothness compared to the surrounding area. It's an interactive activity. Now we're going to take a look at one of the other seas. This is Mare Serenitatis, labeled C here, the Sea of Serenity. But we're not going to look at the entire sea. What we're going to look at is this southwestern rim. And what I want to point out here, you look along the southwestern rim, you may see what appears to be a fracture, a crack in the ground there. And also what I would like you to do is note that very subtly, notice how this southwestern area is darker than, say, the area out here. And that darkness even extends onto what would normally be the light-covered highland. Notice how this is dark. What we are seeing here is this crack, what we call an arcuate rill, is actually an area where there was volcanic activity on the moon. And you had pyroclastic eruptions, fire fountains, dumping dark volcanic ash over this area. And particularly interesting in this area, this is called Rimas Sulpicius Gallus. But this ash deposit, this pyroclastic ash deposit here, is particularly rich in water. That's fascinating. We used to think that the moon was bone dry, but we're finding areas on the exterior and even in the interior where we have surprising amounts of water. So the moon continues to surprise us. So we'll take a look at one more of the seas. Now we'll go to the one labeled G, which is Mare Nectarous. And we can see it right here. Here's the area of the basaltic lava flow. But it also occupies a basin, but it does not fill the basin. You can see part of the rim of that basin right here, especially in this area. This is known as the Altai Scarp. And what we'll do is we'll get a closer look at that scarp here. This is about 3.5 to 4 kilometers tall. So this is really kind of a fun, spectacular area to look at. But you'll notice here that the floor of the impact basin that is not covered in lava has quite a few craters, whereas the area here that does have the basaltic lava has very few. So that tells us that this area is younger than this. That tells us also that this basaltic flooding of the impact basin didn't happen right when the impact happened. It happened well afterwards. So this is, you have the impact formation, and then sometime after that, that's when this basaltic flooding happens. Now this is a fairly old impact basin. A lot of the edge is degraded. We can take a look at a newer one here, looking at Mare Orientale. Again, a multi-ring impact basin. This you will not see on Observe the Moon night. This is just on the very southwest rim of the moon. It'll be in shadow, and we only see a little bit of it. But this illustrates what these multi-ring impact basins look like. Very, very exciting. Continuing onward, let's take a look now at some of the telescopic features that we can look at. And we'll start out with Area 1, which is the Apennine Mountains. This is a great example of a mountain range on the moon. It'll show up very, very well. It's about 600 kilometers long, 5 kilometers high. So that's a height comparable to the Alps here on Earth. This is a major mountain range. But this mountain range was formed as part of the rim of, again, one of those great impact basins, the one that here forms Mare Imbrium. So we're seeing the edge of this impact basin right along in here. Very, very spectacular. Here's a view from Moon Trek, kind of looking down horizontally, and we're looking toward the east here, so you can see how the mountains stick up. Now, Apollo 15 actually landed at the base of these mountains, and it came in going east to west, which means they came in over these mountains. They had to have a much steeper trajectory than the previous Apollos because they had to clear these mountain peaks. And they landed right here in this bay that we see right here, this kind of bay area at the base of the mountain. So they came in flying this way, and they landed right about here. Now, one of the fun things you can see in this is this, it looks like a river channel, but no water ever flowed here. This is Hadley Rill. This was actually carved by flowing lava that erupted right around here, and it flowed out. Hadley Rill is about 800 kilometers long, 1,200 meters deep. And again, this was the landing site for Apollo 15. Hadley Rill is a challenge object in amateur telescopes. It can be seen, but you need a good telescope and you need a good steady night. But on Observe the Moon night, this bay right here, that is occupied by Hadley Rill, this will be visible in even modest telescopes. Something you will not see in telescopes, but we should talk about, of course, is the actual Apollo 15 landing site. And this is the Apollo lunar module. You can see the tracks here. You can see some of the instrumentation that was left behind. This was the first mission that actually employed a lunar rover, the car that they brought. So they were actually able to drive around and cover much more territory. Okay, so next we will head on to our next telescopic feature, labeled 2 here, and that is the Fra Mauro area. And Fra Mauro is a really incredibly unspectacular crater. It is a very old crater. It is very degraded. It's hard to make out here. But there are some interesting things about it. If you look very carefully, you'll see, again, what appear to be fractures on the floor here. And these are called straight rills. And these are areas where lava has come up from beneath the surface through cracks in the crust, and it has widened those cracks, forming faulted structures that we call graben. Also, I want you to take a look right here. You can see how along this crack, there's a little bit of a darkened area. See how that's darker there? What we can do is we can change our view and make things stand out a little bit better by switching from a visible view to, again, a laser altimetry view. And now what I'd like you to see is how these cracks really stand out. And remember this area here that was darker. What we'll do now is we'll zoom in on that, and we can see why. We see this chain of cinder cones where there's actually an eruption along this faulted area. Very, very interesting. But if we move to the north of Fra Mauro, we see kind of the reason that it's really interesting. It's this lumpy, hummocky, hilly terrain, the Fra Mauro Formation, that is ejecta from the Mare Imbrium impact. And so we wanted to send astronauts here to gather material and so we could date when that Mare Imbrium impact happened. And we sent astronauts right here to this area. This was the landing site for the Apollo 14 mission. And so we'll zoom into that. And what we can see here again is the lunar module for Apollo 14. We can see some of the instruments left behind here. This is a mission flown by Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell, who actually landed here. And one of the things that you do not see here are golf balls. And why do I mention golf balls? Well, it turns out Alan Shepard, who was the commander of this mission, and also the first American in space, he flew in the Mercury program. He was the first American to actually fly in space. He was also a real golf fanatic. And he smuggled on board Apollo 14 the head of his 6-iron and 2 golf balls. Now, there are real strict rules against smuggling things on board Apollo spacecraft, but he figured as a national hero, he could probably get by with that. And he was right. And so during one of the actual moonwalks, he pulled out the head of his club, affixed it to the handle of one of the instruments used to collect samples, and made a golf club, and dropped a golf ball on the ground and announced that he was about to hit the first golf ball on the surface of the moon. His first swing was a whiff. He missed it. Now we'll give him credit because in the spacesuit, he was only able to swing with one arm. His second swing, he shanked the ball, and Fred Hayes, who was the Capcom at Houston, a fellow astronaut of his, announced that he had made a terrible slice. Alan then dropped a second golf ball on the ground, swung, and connected beautifully, and announced that it was going miles and miles. We don't see the golf ball here, obviously, but what we do see is the site of the first golf shot on the moon. Kind of fun. Continuing on, we're now going to move to item 3 on our list, which is the crater Alphonsus. And here's the crater Alphonsus, 119 kilometers wide, 2.7 kilometers deep. It's fairly shallow. This is an example of what we call a floor fractured crater. Zooming in, we can see why. Look at, we can see fractures across the floor here. And what we think happened is that magma rising up beneath the crater actually lifted the floor of the crater up. So the floor of the crater was actually raised as a section, and it cracked along the way. And as we had these cracks form, I want you to notice that there's some small rimless craters surrounded by dark halos. These craters here are apparently not impact craters. Let's zoom in on them a little bit. These are actually volcanic craters where we've actually had eruptions, and you're seeing, again, volcanic ash showing up. And this is something that should be visible in telescopes on the night of International Observe the Moon Night. Now, looking back again at the wider view of Alphonsus here, we see something interesting above it and to the left. we see this strange chain of craters here. Now, this isn't on the map. This is your bonus object for watching this webcast. This is something called Catena Davy, D-A-V-Y. Catena means a chain of craters. Now, we see chains of craters on the moon a lot of times in association with chains of volcanic craters. But these are not the rimless kinds of volcanic craters we see. These are impact craters in form. Now, oftentimes, too, we will see chains of impact craters associated with what we call secondary impacts, debris thrown out by a primary impact, by a big impact. But this doesn't trace back to any real appropriate impact crater. And so what has happened is researchers Charles Wood and Robert Wickman came up with a theory that this actually shows where a comet or a small asteroid passed really close to the Earth, was disrupted, broken apart by the Earth's gravity into a stream of debris that then impacted the surface of the moon. We have a similar impact that happened back in 1992. You may remember Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 being broken up into a stream of comets by the gravity of Jupiter and then slamming into Jupiter one after another. So perhaps we're seeing something similar here. Very fascinating stuff going on the moon. Okay, next we're going to go to something called the straight wall. That's item number 5 on our list here. Or no, 4, excuse me, item number 4. And the straight wall is the very best example of a fault on the surface of the moon. You can see it showing up here in this beautiful view. This shows up wonderfully in telescopes. The straight wall is about 120 kilometers long, 450 kilometers high, so it's a step up. And we can see with the elevation profile, we can draw a line across it, and we can see how the terrain steps up as you go across this wonderful fault here. Here's a view from Moon Trek where we're actually looking across, and we can see the fault in kind of a spaceship's eye view here. Very interesting. So again, make sure you look for this beautiful example, the best example of a fault on the moon. This coming International Observe the Moon Night, it will be well placed for observation. Next, we'll go to the crater Tycho. We looked at Tycho a little bit briefly earlier when we first introduced Moon Trek. So this is number 5 on our list of telescopic objects. Here it is, as it would appear, looking straight down, but that's not how you're going to see it on International Observe the Moon Night, because you're going to be viewing it from Earth, and this is fairly far south. So it will be foreshortened, and it will look more like this in your telescope. But this is an example of what we call a complex crater. And it's big enough that the weight of material on the edges here overcame the actual strength of the material. And so what we get is this terraced faulting along the edge here. So we can, let's see, bring that up so you can see the terraces along the inside edge. And you also have a prominent central peak. This is a rebound feature. Picture those kind of slow motion videos you've seen before of like a water droplet hitting a surface. You get a kind of a crater formed in the surface of the water, and then you get a spout coming back up again. And that's what happened here with the fluidized rock. And speaking of fluidized rock, if you look out across the surface of the moon, streaming out from Tycho, you can see long streams of pulverized rock, rays. These show up better closer to full moon. So during partial phases, looking into the terminator, you can see elevated surface features, but at full moon, you get a better view of differences between light and dark. And these sprays of pulverized rock stretching some 1,500 kilometers out from Tycho are a testament to the fact that Tycho is actually a young crater. It's only about 108 million years old, which, as lunar craters go, is young for a large crater. But this is a very wonderfully detailed example of a beautiful impact crater on the moon. And again, I'll encourage you to look at that during International Observe the Moon Night. We will wrap up our, and there, of course, we can do profiles across it. And you've already seen what it looks like looking at the interior and looking at the central peak. We'll wrap up our telescopic views with a look at the far south now, item number 6, that is the crater Clavius. And if you're a fan of the movie and the book 2001, The Space Odyssey, you'll remember this is where Clavius base was located on the moon. But what we see here is an old, flattened, fairly degraded crater. It's big, though. It's 225 kilometers across, and it's shallow. It's only 3.5 kilometers deep. But what makes it so special, noteworthy on this coming International Observe the Moon Night, is this is going to be where we're going to have actual moonrise. You'll watch the moonrise, the terminator, moving across the actual face of Clavius. Now, International of the Moon Night spans quite a few hours in many different time zones, so the view will change. But what you will ideally see as you look at this is the mountains along the rim here actually casting long shadows that will move across the floor of Clavius. So watch for a spectacular sunrise view on the moon as exhibited by Clavius. And one of the really cool things, because Clavius is so big and it is so shallow, the curvature of the moon causes the center of the floor of Clavius to be noticeably higher than the edges. And so when the sun is just rising, the center can be illuminated while parts of the rim and outer areas here are still in shadow. So this is going to be a very fun region to watch. So I'll point out that Moon Trek is just one of a series of programs available on the web. The Planetary Mapping and Modeling Solar System Treks programs. We have similar portals for Mars, for the asteroid Vesta, and we're coming out with new ones for the larger moon of Mars, Phobos, as well as we're looking to some of the moons of Saturn. So keep an eye open. With that, I will thank you very much. Here are the URLs for our Trek programs. And from me and from our incredibly talented development team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who brought all this wonderful technology to you, I want to thank you very much. Back to you, Brooks.
Wow, that was wonderful, Brian. Thank you so much. It's pretty fascinating stuff. I wanted to open up, we have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to open up the chat box for any questions that you all might have for Brian or myself. That was truly, truly fascinating, and can't wait to get home tonight and play with Moon Trek some more. So, Brian, I'll start out. You said that mountain range was 5 kilometers high?
Yeah, so that's the Apennine Mountains. So, again, comparable in height to the Alps here on Earth.
Yeah, that's 3 miles, 1,500 feet. That's taller than what we have here in the Rocky Mountains. That's fascinating. So if you do have questions, insert them in the chat box. Also, I would love to hear if you guys are planning anything for International Observe the Moon Night at your library. If you could share kind of what activities or what programs you'll be doing for International Observe the Moon Night.
I see lots of typing going on.
Yeah.
Oh, I see Anne saying that she knows of at least one library who's done 3D printing of sections and used that for prizes for programs they've done there. And that's a brilliant idea. I'd never thought of anything like that. That's really neat.
Mm-hmm. So, man, it says we've got an astronomer, a storyteller to tell moon stories, moon experiments, and moon face cookies and cocoa. Oh, nice. Or cocoa. Want to come join your International Observe the Moon Night, Amanda? That sounds like a lot of fun. And one thing I do like, there's so much very interesting lunar science to talk about and study, but also there is that cultural element too that you can tie in. Diana says our local astronomy club and science center will have telescopes on site. Very nice. We'll have hands-on activities as well. Great.
We started this program, the Observe the Moon Night program, way back, I want to say it was 2008. It was between the L-Cross mission and the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission. They both launched together on the same rocket. And this was part of the public outreach for those two missions working together. And so we started doing it with that. It was out here at NASA Ames and Goddard Space Flight Center, and I think NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. And then later on, Doris Dow, who at the time was at the NASA Lunar Science Institute and is at headquarters now, brought in some international partners and expanded this to being International Observe the Moon Night. And it's great to see it's still going on.
Right.
Wow, look at all this list of InOMN events that are coming. This is great.
I like Caroline's idea here about inviting patrons to bring their own telescopes, kind of integrating them, not necessarily as experts, but having, if you have an interest in astronomy, come observe with us here at International or at our library. I really like that.
Great idea.
Paula, you're doing yours on October 27th. I understand that. Yeah, it's October 28th is the official date, but of course, if you want to do it beforehand. And yeah, moon trek will be a great idea in the case of inclement weather. So I saw a couple of you say you were going to have hot cocoa. Is there any tie-in to the moon with that, or is that just because hot cocoa is a delicious thing to have on a cold night? It's just cold. Okay, I didn't know if there was some crater activity you could do with that.
There is. Flour and cocoa powder, making craters. That's always fun. I'm sure you can direct them to that, Brooks.
Yeah, I think Kellyanne put that link in earlier for crater impacts. That's a great one to do. Very nice. These are all very great suggestions, guys. I'm glad to see everybody, or so many people are doing. Let's see Anne's advice here. If anyone has small telescopes, test beforehand. Very cool. Yeah, Anne did that with the solar eclipse and had some really wonderful pictures. Yeah, it's great to see everybody participating in this. It really is a great event. And let's see, probably go ahead and start to wrap things up here on our end. When I close out, there is a survey, of course. You'll be redirected to that. And during that survey, there's a question specifically, again, about any feedback you have about timing for these webinars, what's going to be the most useful for you, whether to have it a few weeks in advance, a few months in advance, and so on. So with that, I believe we'll go ahead and close out the virtual classroom. Thank you all so much for joining us. A big thanks to Brian. Brian, I hope we get to see each other again soon at a conference or something else fun. Please make sure to join us. November 8th, we're going to be doing hands-on activities. November 15th, we're going to have the Deputy Social Media Director from NASA, so we hope you'll be able to join us for that. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.